We honor Chris's time with us, but I welcome everyone to the LWVCO Housing Task Force meeting. And just to give everyone a little background in case we have some folks here that haven't been here before, the Housing Task Force's purpose is to inform and engage members across the state to promote collective actions around housing issues as they are strongly aligned with the stated league position. By increasing the understanding and importance of this issue through education, this task force hopes to influence public policy and legislation at all levels through advocacy while speaking with one league voice. The Housing Task Force coordinates with local leagues and other organizations advocating for policies in this area. They organize webinars, workshops, and presentations on major topics of interest within the housing issue and promote justice and equity through advocacy at all levels of government. They are closely aligned with the efforts of the LWVCO Legislative Action Committee and the LWVUS to ensure cohesion. And we have our state legislative action team members here this evening. Andrea Wilkins is the legislative liaison, and members of that team that follow the housing bills are Kathy Smith, can't see her, but I know she's here, Joe Federer, Joe Waves, and Kate Van Houten. They follow the housing bills very closely and indicate, based on our position, whether we support, monitor, or oppose those pieces of legislation. So with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker that we have with us this evening. Chris, and I hope I don't say this middle part wrong, but deGriu Kennedy?
Close.
How do you tell me how you say it?
deGriu.
Okay, Chris deGriu Kennedy.
Yeah.
Chris
yeah, after I took my wife's last name into my last name, I've gotten that question a few times.
Oh,
well, I used to just be Chris Kennedy.
That's thank you for sharing that. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
All right, so Chris joined the Bell Policy Center as president in July of 2024 after 4 terms in the Colorado House of Representatives. He's led efforts to expand economic opportunities for Coloradoans, addressing the high costs of housing along with other critical areas. Chris is a lifelong Coloradoan with degrees from the University of Colorado Boulder and the University of Colorado Denver. And we've asked Chris to come tonight and talk to us about what is smart growth in Colorado. What would that look like? What are some of the barriers that we're facing to increase housing? And what about the tensions between the regional, statewide land use planning versus local control? So lots of things around housing, Chris. It's a big topic, I know. So I'll just ask everyone to mute themselves, please. And Chris, if it's all right with you, well, I'm going to ask you how you'd like questions handled. Should we put them in chat, or do you want people to raise their hands as you're going along?
Honestly, I think with a group this size, we can keep it loose and just kind of see how it goes. So I think people can use their own preferences. If you want to raise your hand, I don't mind interruptions. I don't have a script I'm following, so I kind of prefer to give a shorter blurb at the front end and then have more time for questions and engagement after anyway. So if that works for you, I say everyone can just take this however they prefer.
Perfect. All right, so the floor is yours, Chris.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for having me. I really appreciate it. And I want to start by sharing a couple things that just will be good reading material for later. We just completed an update to our housing primer. So this is kind of a document we wrote on kind of the state of affordable housing in Colorado, as well as, you know, the current policy that's being considered at the Capitol. So this goes beyond the smart growth and land use policy and kind of gets into some of the renters' rights legislation and some of the other things that we have been following at the state capitol. And then I'm also going to share a link to our broader housing hub, which you're going to find, for those of you who live in Jefferson County, you're going to find this extremely helpful. For those of you who live elsewhere, only about 50%. But we have a grant where we're doing specific analysis of housing projects in Jefferson County. So you'll see a lot of documents up there that speak about Jeffco, but some others that speak more broadly about our work. So those are just some good things to read for later on. All right, so back to the question I was actually asked. The smart growth conversation is a difficult one because there are all kinds of different factors that we have tried to balance in making public policy around these kinds of issues. Before the land use discussion started up at the Capitol 2 years ago, really the state level had not grappled with these issues too much, but local governments talked about them all the time. I'm sure this is a very familiar topic to many of you. And so, these topics that we had I'm in Lakewood. We had passed the citizens had passed certain anti-growth measures that really sparked a housing conversation in a powerful way starting in 2019. And there were all these discussions about, well, what does it mean for a suburban city like Lakewood to focus on infill or transit-oriented development? What does it mean to, you know, focus on infill as opposed to having more sprawl happen in communities like in Jeffco? We think a lot about the foothill communities, and there's certain parcels that have been discussed for development right along the foothills. And so that's a really interesting contrast right there when you think about how can local governments set policies where you grapple with these questions of, all right, well, if we don't want to have disruptions to the communities that are living in a place now, then the only answer is to develop somewhere else. I mean, you can also argue not develop at all, but that's also challenging in its own way. And so, you think about how smart growth, transit-oriented development, what that's all about are a few different things. It's about higher density housing near employment and transportation and retail services. It's about reducing vehicle miles traveled so that if people have access to transit, to bike lanes, in some cases walkable communities, they won't have to put as many miles on their car to drive to and from. So it's been interesting how the environmental organizations that are active at the Capitol have really embraced this land use reform conversation about what it means. Well, then now you zero in, let's assume that what we're saying for smart growth at the moment is prioritizing infill development. Well, then you're almost inevitably creating some sort of disruption for the community that is there. So now it's a question of, okay, how much disruption is appropriate? What kind of disruption is appropriate? Because, everyone's heard the term NIMBY. It's too easy of an answer to say, oh yeah, well, we believe in more apartments, just not here. So the question is coming up with a fair standard. And I believe that the local government voice continues to be an incredibly important part of this, but it is a balancing act because prior to the land use reforms of the last couple of years, there were numerous municipalities that were not authorizing any new development or new growth. And that made it really tricky where you found the investment happening elsewhere. You found negative impacts on the communities where that wasn't happening. I realize this is kind of rambly, and that's kind of by design because I find it that this is actually how complicated it really is. Another example I've seen in Lakewood is those who have not been very fond of some of the multifamily developments that have been proposed, tend to come back and propose, well, we need a new transportation study. We need a new environmental study. And I believe it's appropriate to a point to do those kinds of studies. But then at a certain point in time, those kinds of things just end up being kind of deliberate strategies to slow down projects and make sure they never happen. And it's been that exact climate and culture that I believe has led us to the point of being about 100,000 units short of where we need to be for housing in the Denver metro area. So I think it's fair to pick apart some of the legislation that has passed, whether it be about the required upzoning in transit oriented communities, whether it be the prohibition on local governments mandating parking minimums. There are certainly fair concerns about some of those policies. I think that from my view, they have been steps in the right direction while still maintaining a local government voice where the citizens have an opportunity to weigh in on individual projects in front of their county commissioners or their city council. But it is pretty darn far from simple. I'll pause there before I move into the second question in case there's anything folks want to talk about.
So, so Chris, yeah, could you talk a little bit more about the blocking of some of these projects by continuing to ask, because I know I'm from Loveland and we had a recent project here that I think they did at least 3 and maybe as many as 5 traffic studies. And it's like, it didn't resolve anything, but as you say, it did delay the movement of the project. So what can be done or what can be put in place to prevent those kinds of things from getting in the way?
That's perhaps the hardest question. I mean, first of all, I have to acknowledge a limitation on my own knowledge here. I know a healthy amount about the state policy. I know a pretty healthy amount about a lot of the communities in Jefferson County because that's where I represented. I can't pretend to know the whole range of different ways that different local governments have dealt with this. I think that it's just that these studies are appropriate up to a point, but it kind of comes down to community engagement and involvement. One of the things I have observed is the folks who are opposed to new housing developments tend to be very frequent visitors at city council meetings, very common visitors at town hall meetings, and speak up quite loudly about their concerns. And the other side, the folks who support more affordable housing development, have not been quite as loud. And so I find that the city councils often feel like they have to be responsive to those voices who show up. And so they tend to say, well, if the community's upset, I guess we better do the extra study. And so I think my first thought is people just need to show up and say, yes, we do believe that we need more affordable housing in this community. We do believe that the city council or the county commission should authorize, whether it's a rezoning or other kinds of procedural votes that are taken in these city councils, uh, that we believe that this is a value to our community.
Yeah, thank you. Kate, did I see your hand up?
Yeah, you did, and that was part of the question that, part of what my comment was going to be about was that I've been pretty active in the Lakewood City Council and Ward 4 meetings, and mostly as an observer. But my take is that the new comprehensive plan that is being in a draft stage right now, which was crowdsourced essentially from the citizens and residents of Lakewood, it is, and what's going on with state legislature is being characterized as something being imposed somehow on people that don't want it. And they're hopping mad, and they're very vociferous about that mad. And it's really unfortunate that there aren't more people that are able to come and speak intelligently and speak positively about what this means for our community to have these types of plans in place where it's smart growth. So for instance, I listened to the earlier this month, the Green Mountain Waters and Sanitation District had a board meeting, and there was some very negative comments about things being rammed down the throats of the district and the residents of Lakewood from the state, having to do with the new legislation regarding lower tap fees for new development, as well as, things about ADUs and other codes and zoning. So we are in a preliminary stage of having public hearings on the local zoning changes. But it's hard to overcome that negative, louder, vociferous, and not very accurate voice. I mean, honestly, they're not thinking about their children's futures very much, or the reality of employers trying to be able to employ workers and have them live near their jobs because they can't afford the housing.
Yeah, I think all of that is right. And yet, it's understandable why this is complicated. I don't pretend that this is one of those black or white issues, not that there are very many of those in general, but I think it is understandable why people feel concerned about the impact of these developments. And yet these comprehensive plans really are the most responsible way for a local government to determine where this growth is going to happen. And Kate was speaking to the most recent comp plan process, but the same is true of the previous generation, whenever that was 10 or 15 years ago that they adopted their last comp plan. And I know that that kind of process is very common across cities and counties as they talk about what their comp plan revisions are going to look like over time. And so I think, you think about some of these examples where it starts to feel common sense. You have a section like West Colfax that runs right through my former district, place where there has been all kinds of investment that has fled the area. And, once upon a time there was a grocery store and now it's gone. And so that area is technically a food desert. You can make the case all day long that that's a great place for higher density housing. But then you think about the radius or the distance from that transportation corridor, whether it's a quarter mile or a half mile where you have this upzoning, suddenly you get 5 blocks into a neighborhood and it starts to feel a lot different. So these are difficult conversations, but I do think that participating in the comprehensive plan process, supporting the city councils and county commissions as they adhere to it, as they plan new growth, is the right thing.
Any other questions or comments for Chris before we move forward? Okay.
Should I move on to the next question?
Yes, I'm sorry.
All
Go
right.
ahead.
No,
Chris.
it's okay. I mean, so the next question was kind of more granular about the barriers that exist, the role that local jurisdictions play. So we've kind of gotten into that stuff to some extent already, but I'll start with this. There's a mention of by right zoning. So the idea that a property owner has the right to develop as they see fit within certain limits without a specific action by the governing body to determine. And the best example of what has actually transpired has been around accessory dwelling units or ADUs. I think that there had been a time where a number of jurisdictions, and this is a conversation happening across this country, local jurisdictions saying you don't have the authority as a property owner to develop an additional dwelling unit on your property. And it's one of those that was kind of seen as the low-hanging fruit of policy change in Colorado, where if you just establish this actually isn't up to your local government, it's up to an individual property owner to determine whether they want to add an ADU on their property. But so I think it's a step in the right direction, but I don't think it has fundamentally solved or changed our housing climate either. You can't ADU your way out of our housing shortage that we have. But I will also say that the 2023 version of the land use bill included a more provocative proposal, which was the ability to increase the size of your property to a sixplex by right. So the idea of any property owner could just turn their home into a sixplex at any point that they wanted to. You can see an argument in support of this, that if people are able to increase the number of humans living on any given parcel, that really contributes to solving the housing shortage. But you can also imagine, smaller communities, smaller parcels, and what that looks like where you're putting in higher density without thinking through all the other ramifications on the community. So that proposal was walked back, and it was, the 2023 bill died. When they reintroduced pieces of the 2023 bill in 2024, that was not one of the provisions that carried on. Now, I have continued to hear a little bit of chatter about it, but not about going all the way to sixplexes. There are conversations about allowing duplexes or triplexes by right. I'm not sure the status of those conversations right now. It doesn't seem to be. I mean, this would have to be a state law that established this, and I have not heard any conversation about that probably in the last month or so. So I don't expect that to go anywhere. There was a question about building codes and the parts they play here. I'm remembering back to my days as a structural engineer where I lived and breathed building codes all the time. And, I think that when people talk about building codes as a barrier to construction, I think often it is those who are critical of some of the energy standards that we've put in place, and ideas like moving away from gas appliances towards electric appliances so that we're not consuming as much natural gas. So, you can make an argument for consumer choice, and I won't deny that there is some cost impact of requiring builders to include certain provisions in every building they build. But at the end of the day, I actually think this one is much ado about nothing. And I think that, there's a lot of work done by the folks that work on these building codes to streamline and to align and to try to avoid excesses. Um, and so I think that the building code process is one where you set some good standards. I think that I'm a believer in the work that has gone into building codes over the last many years to make sure that we're doing a better job building more energy efficient houses that don't just leak hot air into the outside in the middle of winter, as well as pushing for more efficient appliances. But there is a cost component that I cannot deny. I just don't think it's the major problem with building out more affordable housing. I think when you compare the magnitude of those kinds of changes to just the regular inflation of building materials that has steadily increased faster than the inflation of other consumer goods over the last couple decades, I think it's pretty clear that it's just regular cost pressures on both building materials and labor that have had the more significant impact on housing cost. There are no questions. I can keep moving through them and we can have more time at the end for just an open discussion, but I can also pause if there's specific ones.
Anyone want to hop in with a question? Kathy?
Hi, thanks.
Hey.
That was great. Could you go a little bit more into the barriers that local codes raise as extra things that need to be done? And thinking about, for example, the modular housing bill that's trying to regionalize modular housing building codes across the state. That's actually going to try to make it more efficient and make it so they can factory build structures year round. But dealing with all these various local zoning codes from various times with various reasons is a big obstacle. And I think it has that for a lot of developers too. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll start answering, and then if I'm not quite getting at what you were asking, you can feel free to press me to follow up. But, what my understanding of the issue is that it's not fundamentally about the idea that any particular building code is too robust a standard. I think it's the variation between municipalities and all the jurisdictions that creates a lot of confusion for those folks. So when Kathy talks about these modular buildings, I mean, it's true, doing these factory built structures can save considerable cost, increase the precision of the construction. And yet, if these builders have to customize what they're doing for every jurisdiction, I mean, just think about how many jurisdictions there are in the Denver metro area alone. Those kinds of things can be challenging to the expansion of modular construction. And yet, at the same time, this is one of those things that local governments have been really resistant to give up. And there's reason for that. There's a desire to make sure that local governments have the opportunity to hold the highest standard. And there have been times that we have talked about how, well, you can establish a really high statewide standard, and then any local government who wants to can go an even higher standard. But you can see how even that kind of variation would create a problem in these cases. So I tend to think the best approach to this sort of thing has to do with intergovernmental agreements or memorandums of understanding where you cultivate an understanding among jurisdictions who want to work together on this and help them reach agreements on using a consistent building code standard. I'm not sure about the extent to which this may or may not already be done. I'm afraid I'm just not sure, but I suspect there's some talk about that already, and I think maybe there could be more. Okay, moving on to question number 3. How can we reduce the tensions between regional and statewide land use planning that tends to streamline regulations versus local control interests? I mean, that's Kathy kind of just got us right into that question. And it's kind of what we've already been talking about. So I see Joe has her hand up, so we'll take another question. Joe, you're muted still.
Sam, I'm in the middle of a Zoom meeting. Can I call you back? Oh, I was going to say that I've been working on House Bill 1198 on regional uh, planning. Um, I'm trying to think. Regional Planning Roundtable Commission. And I was just wondering what you were thinking about getting into the other parts of Colorado.
Thank you for that question. I was just looking up House Bill 1198 as you spoke because I hadn't spent a lot of time looking at that one yet. When you talk about the rest of Colorado, what's your primary question about what are we doing to build out affordable housing in general, or how do these state versus local conflicts take place in rural Colorado?
How rural Colorado, um, how this bill could help the rural Colorado since so much is done in the Denver metropolitan area.
Yeah, I'm not sure how this bill itself would necessarily. Let me just. I'm gonna take a quick look at the description of it. Yeah, I'm not sure about this particular bill. This one does seem to be more focused on regional planning within these kinds of areas. I think in rural Colorado, it's often a different kind of question because there is often more land that can be developed, but there's also a lot of different kinds of rural counties in Colorado, from the ski resort towns to the places in the Eastern Plains that have been suffering from underinvestment for a very long time. And so I find that it's a little bit of a different challenge where, you in the ski towns, you often need a different kind of housing than what the residents need, right? You need workforce housing. And so it's been a challenge figuring out how to build that housing supply. In some other parts of Colorado, it's less about building housing supply because they're frankly losing population most of the time. So these are big challenges. I apologize if that didn't get exactly your question. Feel free to follow up.
Okay.
My, I'm not as when I was in the legislature, I basically knew what was going on with every bill. Now I prepared myself by reading over several of the bills that we're going through, but I don't know every aspect of what's happening. So I apologize. So I think, the one other thing that was specifically mentioned in Andrea's email was about the smart stair codes. And I just think what that was trying to do was, taking a look at whether it's really necessary to have multiple stairways for certain kinds of buildings. And I'll tell you, I've heard an earful from the firefighters that they absolutely think more stairwells are necessary. So there is a real discussion here about what are the right kinds of public safety provisions to put in place in these new projects, and how do you balance those public safety concerns with the affordability concerns. And again, I don't think there's a yes or a no answer on it. I think it's just a matter of working through the balance. If we're going to waive a requirement saying it's okay in some instances just to have a single stair in these buildings, well, one of the other things that building codes speak to is egress routes, how you have to be able to map out from any given room of your house, like how many steps it's going to take for you to exit in the case of an emergency. And I think figuring out the balance where, okay, if you're going to have fewer stairwells, well, what are your egress routes going to look like? And what does that mean for real public safety concerns? So these things are challenging, and I think for the state government to jump into it is mostly in response to the fact that under the previous status quo, we were just not seeing as much development of affordable housing as we needed to keep up with the demand and the growth of the population, especially in the Denver metro area, but in other parts of Colorado as well.
Vaughn, I see your hand up.
Yes, I'm curious, do stairwells cost a lot more? I mean, do they figure in the cost of a building?
I think the answer is it depends on the kind of building. You see a lot of multifamily construction where people are accessing a second or a third story building those stairwells are not just wood stairwells, right? Those tend to be steel and concrete. There's also square footage that is occupied by that. So every time you're using square footage for stairwells as opposed to for living space, that certainly does come with a cost. I can't tell you the exact amount of cost or how much these projects would save if they had fewer stairwells. I think that some of the approach that's been taken by the affordable housing advocates is the capital is there's no one solution to the problem. So we have to work on several small things and hope that the cumulative effect is increased affordability of our housing supply.
Okay, I would think the insurance costs would be lower if there were more stairwells.
Yeah, I think that that is potentially true. I can't speak to it for certain because I think the insurance companies are going to be evaluating these risks, and it's hard to know whether the simple existence of a stairwell is enough or whether they calculate the insurance risk a different way. But you may be right.
Thanks, Vaughn. Cindy, I see your hand.
Yes, I live in Denver, and when that one was proposed in Denver, we were very concerned that houses that many people can live in, more than one family, that if this went through, there would be houses torn down because that allows a living unit to be, or a multifamily unit to be put on smaller lots. So you're basically taking materials, putting them in the dump, building a new one, and you're only gaining maybe one more space where that house may have fit more than that. So it really wasn't legislation that would gain much. Does that make sense?
What is going to lead to the purchase of a property for redevelopment? You may very well be right that if you create a condition that allows for a greater number of units on the same lot size, does that increase the possibility that that property is sold and redeveloped? Yeah, I can see that.
Mhm.
I don't know if this would be the most significant driver of that or not, but I can see that that's the direction of the effect.
We're used to developers coming in, tearing down things, making it more expensive, and people can't afford it and they're moving out of Denver. So
Yeah.
that one just didn't seem to make sense at all for Denver.
Yeah, I believe that. Let me just opine on one other related thing while we're at it. I've been thinking a lot recently about the interaction of housing policy and displacement. And this is in part because we had a fellowship program last year where a woman named Kelly Mitchell did a really fascinating project about gentrification in the Five Points neighborhood and what it meant for the Black communities that lived there. I'll post a link to this in the chat in just a moment, too. But it was somewhat eye-opening for me recognizing, I've been familiar with the broader trends of gentrification and what it looks like. But I think I had maybe an overly simplistic perspective that, well, it's one thing if it's a landlord that sells the property out from under their renters to sell to a development. And that kind of displacement is difficult because it upsets a lot of the people who are relying on affordable rental properties in that area. And the simplistic part was that I thought, well, if an individual owned a property and they made a choice to sell it, well, that's their choice, and that's fine. That's just the way the market works. And that's not entirely untrue, but it is more complicated than that because there are all kinds of other cost pressures that get put on people. Think property taxes. You might be in a perfectly good place paying for, you've paid off the mortgage on your property and you're just paying the property tax bill while living off of Social Security. And then all of a sudden, there's all this development in your neighborhood. Your home value goes up. Your property tax bill goes up. You may not feel very comfortable using the deferral program because you don't want to lean on your property that you have to pass along to the next generation when you pass. And so these things just they are so much more complicated than that. And the way that this displacement happens has everything to do with economic security of individual families and older adults and young workers and everyone in between. And so part of what I've come to is one of the most significant solutions we need to this problem in general, so that we're not pushing people out of communities, is we just need to make sure that people have more, stable economic conditions in general, which could include a more fair tax code where regular folks and middle class folks pay a little bit less, the wealthier pay more of their fair share. Those kinds of systems, I believe, could create an environment where there's less pressure for people to sell a property and therefore contribute to the gentrification. But yeah, it's always complicated. But I'm going to repeat that you should all definitely read this because the study of the families in 5 Points is just fascinating, and there's all kinds of little nuggets in there about the history of jazz and the Green Book, the hotels where it was safe for Black musicians to stay when they were traveling through Denver. There's just a lot that I didn't know that jumped out at me about gentrification when I read this. So I highly recommend it.
I don't know if she mentioned in that book, but when the assessor starts assessing areas that have been gentrified that are adjacent to that area, those taxes have gone up without those houses being changed.
Yeah.
And so there has been a big fight by some city council people that were aware of that so that they wouldn't get their taxes raised.
Yeah, I believe it.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cindy. Tracy, I see your hand up.
Yes, hi, Chris.
Hey, Tracy.
So, hi. So I have a question to go back to the local control versus regional approach. I'm wondering, I have not heard any conversation about this. And I'm wondering what the direction of policymakers like yourself are looking at it. That at least the municipalities of Arvada and Westminster, there might be more, but those councils have made a decision to not follow the state laws that have been passed around the parking requirements and the ADUs. And my understanding is that CML has made a decision to work with their municipalities to not follow those state law requirements. So what's the conversation around this? Is there an approach, something that policymakers, the regional, statewide policymakers are going to take around this, or are they just going to let it go?
So I'm afraid to say this is the first I'm hearing that local governments are potentially not participating in these policies. I don't know the state of the conversation on that. I will say I never thought that the state had very compelling enforcement mechanisms for these policies in the first place. So it was easy for us to say you have to do this, but there was a point in time where the policy was considering threatening local governments by withholding their transportation funding if they didn't participate in these processes. Those punitive measures were taken out of the legislation, but I'm honestly not sure the current view on enforcement or what it looks like if certain local governments don't participate in those state laws. Do you have you heard anything, Tracy?
I have not, and that's why I was wondering. It's been so very quiet, and I'm wondering if maybe it's something people are looking at putting off until after session to be able to deal with, or what. But both Arvada and Westminster, and I'm sure there's other municipalities, have very, and Mindy just put her hand up too, have very clearly said we're not going to follow those state laws.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't know. I'll have to ask around.
But I'm sure Mindy has more information.
All right, thanks, Tracy. Kate, I see your hand.
Hi, yeah, I won't take very much time on this because I could talk for forever actually. But I'm kind of the local single stair access person. And I've been studying it for 2 years and I've been absorbing all of the studies and information that have been supplied by various safety experts. And actually double loaded corridors is what they call the big apartment complexes that are multi-story have to have two stairwells. It takes longer to get just to the stairwell from the interior apartments than any of the single stair design concepts. Those are only limited to 5 stories, and they're all very compact on each floor. And yes, they would take be an infill project for single family home lots, but also parking lots. If that do really no good for anybody in affordable housing whatsoever. And they're using materials that are much more safe than what are put into any of these large apartment complexes. And what makes them affordable rather than luxury is that they require less land purchase, which is one of the biggest ticket items of the developer for their projects. And it's much more comprehensively compact. And each unit has windows on on a corner, so it's not just on one wall, you know, and you've got a balcony, and the rest are windowless walls and stuff like that. So there's a lot of advantages, and there's also ventilation advantages, there's materials advantages that make it so that they're, number one, very safe, and number two, aesthetically much more pleasing, but they're also affordable because of their size and the siting for them. As to safety, there was one of the fire marshals from Seattle, where they have been having this particular kind of builds and these codes for since 1973, have said that there are no concerns from firemen there. They're safe. The other larger buildings are actually much more challenging for fire people. So just to let you know that there's a lot of information out there and available through different resources, but I'm one of them if you need it.
Well, we're lucky you were here. I like to pretend I'm an expert, but the reality is, there's a lot of ground to cover. So grateful that you've dug into this and were able to answer some of those questions. That's great.
Thanks, Kate. Mindy.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Chris. I did want to touch on local control, but this is somewhat tangential to what Tracy brought up. On the one hand, we're seeing a lot coming from the state and certainly from the governor's office in support of infill, higher density around transit stations. And I certainly understand that desire, but by the same token, at least here in West Jefferson County, the unincorporated Jeffco and Arvada along Highway 93, we're seeing essentially, I don't know if it's unfunded mandates is the right word. I'm just sort of complaining about all these decisions that are being made to form new employment centers, the Quantum Commons Hub at Highway 93 and 72, and now this massive data center that the Trump administration wants to build on NREL land along Highway 93 and Highway 128, just north of the old Rocky Flat site. Those things will have huge impacts on housing needs, workforce housing needs, transportation along those highways, Indiana Street, Highway 93, and we have no mass transit out there. And so I'm seeing a real disconnect between the infill goals of the state and our governor's office and what's being thrown at our local governments and our counties to deal with. So I'm venting.
I think there's a lot there, and and Tracy can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but my understanding is that Arvada's growth plan has involved a westward movement for some time. So I don't know that it's any state-driven policies that are prompting the development along Highway 93. I remember talking to former mayor of Arvada, Ken Fellman. This was a long time ago. This was when I was first running for office. But he was talking to me about the importance of the Jefferson Parkway issue and its interaction with Arvada's growth plan. And so I remember seeing these maps of where Arvada hoped to expand westward into that area. And so, I think we can certainly talk about the pros and cons of it, but to my knowledge, that's not the state that's driving that. Now, the quantum computing caught my interest in part because there was an economic development bill last year that set aside something like $35 million. Now, these are dollars that, because it was done as a tax credit, it came out of the Tabor surplus as opposed to competing with general fund appropriations for K-12 or Medicaid. But it was nonetheless spending the state money to try to attract these jobs into Colorado. And I've been around long enough to know that there were times that was an incredibly important part of state policy. When we were coming out of the Great Recession, I was working as a legislative aide at the state capitol in 2010, and that was the whole conversation at the Capitol that session. What can we do to incentivize more jobs? And we passed a number of policies that would incentivize businesses to locate in Colorado and create jobs here as opposed to somewhere else. There are people that work on this kind of policy all the time at both the state and the local level, and probably disagree with an awful lot of what I say about these issues, because I was one of the very few legislators who voted no on that quantum computing tax credit. And it's not because I don't think there's a great deal of potential for the future of quantum computing. It's that what I have seen in Colorado is that, in large part because of the Tabor Amendment, our tax base never keeps up with the needs. And so you have our existing tax structure, and new people come in paying the existing tax rates. You're not going to have enough to build out the infrastructure to support that new population, let alone what it means for where we want these buildings and developments to happen, and what it means for quality of life. It just purely becomes a question of dollars and cents. And so I spoke up about this, and I frankly lost some friends over it who thought I was crazy. But I thought, this is not the right way to be doing this. Until we can fix Colorado's tax code such that the employment here, that people like those who have the means to pay more taxes are paying enough that we can invest in our schools and our higher ed and our healthcare system and all of these other things to the extent that we need to truly support economic opportunity for everybody. We cannot be giving away $35 million to incentivize more jobs to come in here. We are just doubling down on digging a hole for ourselves that is going to come home to roost as soon as we have even a minor recession where we no longer have a Tabor surplus. And now we're just, you've seen the budget cuts this year. We cut $1.2 billion from the state budget, once you kind of account for population and caseload growth. And so I find that some of this economic development work needs to be more narrowly tailored and focused in certain areas, certain kinds of projects that we need. And we have to fix Tabor so that the wealthy will pay their fair share, and that we can invest in the kind of things that make this state what we want it to be.
Good points. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Yes.
Anytime I get to talk about Tabor is a good day.
All right. Additional questions, comments? I just have one that it's just a comment that I hear quite often around housing in Colorado. And that is, we have a lot of development going on. There's a lot of building going on, but the match is not there for the type of housing that we need. So how do we incentivize developers, or what are some things that can be done to incentivize the building of the right types of houses? Because what I see being built, they're beautiful, but they're not what we say we need when we talk about affordable housing.
Yeah. If you'd asked me this question 5 years ago, I would have given you a different answer. 5 years ago, I would have said that building a housing project is really expensive. And if you're not creating public systems that incentivize or require a certain number of units to be affordable, the builders are just going to build the market rate or luxury products where they can make the highest return on their investment. And so we're now competing with that. And since the passage of Proposition 123, which for all intents and purposes set aside $350 million a year out of our Tabor surplus funds for investments of different kinds in housing, you pair that with the expansion of the low-income housing tax credit, a number of different local investments that have been made. We're now in a place where I actually think we're doing a reasonable job investing in affordable housing. And yet it's still, and maybe part of this is a lag time, that it takes a little while for this policy to grow roots and start affecting the way development actually happens. But there still seem to be reasons to believe that we're not doing enough. And I know that there's a couple reasons I think this may be the case. One, uh, a lot of local governments allow a fee to be paid for a developer to opt out of certain affordability requirements. And this has become an easier option, perhaps because the fees are not set high enough, but it becomes an easy choice for developers to make, knowing that, well, we'll pay this one-time fee, but then we'll have 30 years of making greater profit because these units are all market rate. And so I think what we really need to be doing is moving into a mandatory inclusionary zoning situation where, cities are accountable for a certain percentage of units that are authorized any given year being truly affordable. Now, some jurisdictions have adopted their own inclusionary zoning policies in that way, requiring those numbers of units to be affordable. But there's a collective action problem here in that if only one jurisdiction is grappling with doing this, there's a real risk that the developer will go elsewhere. And some of these jurisdictions know that they really need this development in their community. And so if they're worried that, well, if we do this inclusionary policy, we're just going to lose the opportunity to do any number of affordable housing projects. So it's better for us to just maintain a deregulated environment and let them do whatever they want. So when I speak to the idea of a mandatory policy, it's the idea is overcoming this collective action problem so that, every jurisdiction in Denver Metro, we're in it together. We're all trying to work towards solving this affordability problem together. We're all going to take responsibility for some number of affordable units in our own community. And I believe those kinds of changes could meaningfully address the problem you're getting at.
Thanks, Chris. Price, I'm sorry.
Trees, yeah,
Trees, go ahead.
thanks, Trish. Hi, Chris. I'm from Park County, and I've not heard much from anyone who's from a rural county. I'm from a rural county, and our challenges are a bit different. Our Board of County Commissioners decided not to engage in any Prop 1, 2, 3 reimbursements or any of that. Two out of the three of them ran for county commissioner with establishment of affordable housing advisory board as part of their campaign. So when finally, after 3 years, everyone's going, where is this affordable housing board? And they said, oh, okay. So then they asked for applications and a bunch of us applied. They accepted 12 or 18 of us. We all gave our little presentations about what our expertise was. And then the Board of County Commissioners decided not to seat an affordable housing board because what is the point? The county commissioners shouldn't be in the business of building housing. So there were some really, really qualified people who applied to be on the board. We are having a meeting this Wednesday, which is kind of what my question is based upon. I'd like to go to this meeting with some possible information from this group. What we've decided as our group in Park County is we basically cannot produce single-family homes that would be considered affordable in Park County. So we're looking at multifamily, probably a mixed ownership, condo ownership, and apartment rental units. And there are only 3 areas in our county that have the infrastructure for it: Alma, Fairplay, and Bailey. There's 2 places in Bailey that actually have water and sewer. If you had to put in an entire septic system water supply for a multi-unit development, it would just be prohibitively expensive. Plus, we don't have a lot of water in Park County, which is ironic because all our water is sent to you guys down there. But anyway, my question, I guess, Chris, is what can I take to this group on Wednesday? What can we do to maybe encourage our commissioners? What they can do, from my point of view, is offer up some land, because that's what's expensive, and the county owns a lot of land. They could offer up some land in these areas with infrastructure and then partner with local developers to build, because then they might build affordable housing if they had a break on the cost of the land. But
Yeah.
we're not getting anywhere.
Well, I don't know that I have any brilliant insights about it. I'm posting one thing in the chat right now. Another one of our fellowship projects with some folks in Colorado Mountain College that were looking at housing issues in mountain communities. I don't know for sure that this is a great fit for Park County, but it's worth taking a look at to see if anything
Okay.
jumps out at you. One question, Therese, is I mean, is when I think about a city like or a city area like Denver where population has come here for jobs to a large extent, and there's just not enough housing, which has prompted this need for more housing. Has that been your experience in Park County as well, that you've got people coming there for other reasons and they can't find housing? Or are you trying to actually incentivize some amount of population growth by building out affordable housing?
We're actually trying to provide housing for the people that work in Park County.
Yeah.
So we don't have anywhere for our teachers, our firefighters, our
Yeah.
emergency workers. Our deputies drive like from Lakewood and Littleton, hour and a half to get to work. And if they're on call, which we don't have 24-hour service anymore because we don't have enough deputies. And so for 12 hours in the nighttime, these deputies are on call. And the commissioners actually brought in a box car and are trying to outfit that for these guys so they have a place to sleep up there when they're on call. But it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think your land idea is a really good one. I know that, the land can be the most expensive part of housing projects in a number of areas. I guess I'm just curious if that's where if your commissioners have the will. It almost sounds like they're not fully committed to solving this, but I may be speaking out of turn because I don't know them or who they are. So I don't even I can make assumptions about the partisanship, but I'm not really trying to do that right now. So I think I'm just, these are all solvable problems, but they're hard. So you really have to get in there and figure it out. And, I'm sure Park County, you know, didn't have a huge surge in home values like certain other parts of the state did, where they're probably not swimming in extra property tax revenue that they could just reinvest everywhere they want to. But I think there has to be some amount of balance. And I think if the county's contribution to solving the housing problem is land, they may be able to use that to cultivate agreements with developers to build out the kind of affordable housing that is needed.
We actually did have a huge surge in prices,
You
which is
did?
why nobody can afford to live there anymore, particularly on the Bailey side, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
Huge surge, like doubling, tripling the values. But the problem is these young people coming in to take on active jobs like teaching and firefighting, and they have to be fairly young, fairly fit, younger people. They have nowhere to live. And the sheriff's department talks about it, the school districts talk about it, and they talk to the commissioners, and the commissioners are pretty grounded in the idea that they are not in the housing business. And I'm going, no, you're not, but you could be helping. So you're making
Yeah.
some assumptions about my commissioners that are probably absolutely true,
Hmm.
but that's not the point. The point is I am a small blue dot in a huge red sea, and it's possible to make change and have things happen even so.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really hard. I mean, I think the land idea is a good one, and I'd be happy to continue this conversation, but I just don't know.
Yeah, I might approach you outside of the meeting and see what we can come up with.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
I'm putting my email address in the chat right now.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And also, in case you all missed it, I did post a link to signing up for the Bell Policy Center's email blasts. We're not fundraising spammers, I promise. We do an email about once every 2 weeks. It's usually full of content about our latest research, whether it be on housing or consumer lending or aging in Colorado. So I'm always trying to get more people reading our content. So the link is in the chat if you're interested.
Thank you.
Do we have time for one last question? All right, Kathy.
Thanks. I was going to try to wind us back to sort of the smart growth and local control, and this land issue kind of is a good example of really the need to build where there is infrastructure in the cities, infill, and more dense housing, and in the rural communities, just where there's infrastructure. And a bill, we're about to do a action alert from the league about a bill that's up in the Senate, House Bill 1169. Yes, in God's backyard has been the nickname. And it basically allows faith organizations and public schools and state universities to have a streamlined process to build housing on their land. And at least in the cities, the land is where there is already infrastructure and transportation and you know it's been an issue with local control issues, whether or not folks have been able to develop their land in an efficient and affordable way and serve the needs of the community. So just kind of wanted to put this out there, and if you want to give us some of your thoughts about that bill, Chris, it'd be great.
My first thought is I'm bored with the acronym already. The YIGB. I feel like I've heard 500 people say YIGB to me this session because, you come up with a clever acronym in politics and, you've got your whole career made. I think it's a fairly common sense policy. If there is a religious institution that has land that they want to use for this sort of purpose, I think it makes all the sense in the world. And I think the policy makes a lot of sense. I think this is not a question about really imposing anything on anyone against their will. It's the question of if you live next to a church-owned property and you're frustrated about development in general, then those are the people that are probably going to have the concerns about this bill.
So in other words, Kathy, stay tuned for the action alert, right? Yes, yes. Okay, Chris, I see one more hand. If we could just do this one quick, and I promise we'll wrap up. Tracy.
Thank you. So I just wanted to mention, and some people have heard me say before, in my experience, in the same day, I would hear from academics and policymakers talking about the conversation that we've been having tonight about the need for higher density housing, the need for how are we supposed to do this. But on the same day, I would hear from citizens where there were projects that were mandated by these laws in their neighborhoods. And citizens were outraged. They didn't want high density in their neighborhood. They don't want, forget the stairways. They don't want, and in my experience, I've seen a real disconnect between the policymakers and the academics and citizens. And I want to suggest, and I think, Chris, your organization is probably real key in this, that we need to really focus on educating the public. If this is the direction that we want to go in and that we feel the need to go in, I think there needs to be a real education need. And I got to tell you, I feel a little bit like I don't want, people to build in their backyards, these mother-in-law buildings in my neighborhood. So I just think that it's a piece that we've missed as we've talked about local control versus regional. We've talked about some of the needs in the communities, that we don't have the general public on board with this. What do you think, Chris?
I think you're right. I think there are a lot of people that are really concerned about development in their communities, and they have good reasons to be. It's not simple. It's not black and white. And I think that the part where I struggle is I mean, I wholeheartly agree on the need for public education about these problems, but I also think that's hard. We try, there are public education campaigns all the time. You think about just a campaign around a statewide ballot measure that they raised $20 million to conduct a statewide. It's not the best form of education because it's all sound bites in those cases, but you just get a sense for the magnitude of the effort that would go into that kind of education. And then going beyond that, I think that you're still going to have differences of opinion. I mean, I will tell you that the conversation we had in Lakewood, that a lot of the opponents of new affordable housing really kind of believed the if you build it, they will come theory. That every time we try to build out affordable housing, it just draws in more people. Whereas some others would say the people are already here, we just need to build the housing to accommodate the people that are already here. I don't really think there's a right or wrong answer to this question. I think that they're both probably true to an extent because the way the market operates, the way the movement of people and families and jobs and housing operates, it's not one dimensional. So I think you're right, Tracy, that these are real challenges and that what it has felt like to an awful lot of people over the last 2 years is the state is completely disregarding their voices and just jamming through policies over their objections. And it's a very difficult problem. I think I don't regret my votes in support of these policies, but I also, you know, had a lot of deep conversations with my community and people disagreed with me, but I explained to them why I supported the policies and why I thought it was important to do. And I think to a large extent, people respected that. They were okay with difference as long as you had an honest conversation with them about it. And I think it's just a difficult thing about politics in general right now is we are so polarized. I know the league does good work on this stuff in general, but as a community, we're so polarized. The negative partisanship is even more powerful than positive partisanship, in that even if you don't feel that great about your own team, you really, really dislike the other team. And it has just led to these lack of trust, these cognitive biases, and an inability for us to have the hard conversations we really need to have. And so, gosh, I better find a more hopeful tone to end on tonight before we close out. But I'll say this, that there are things that are really challenging, and there are signs of progress where we do have breakthrough conversations and breakthrough agreements that happen and meaningful progress on solving the really difficult problems. And for me, it's just a matter of sticking to it. And sometimes you take steps backwards, but a lot of time you get a step forward, and you can make a big difference in people's lives.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Chris. We know there's still much work to be done in this housing area, but we have strong housing advocates across the state of Colorado in the league. And yeah, our work is around advocating and educating. So we just keep doing what we can in the communities that we're in to promote affordable housing. So on that note, we will thank you so much for spending part of your evening with us, Chris, and we'll say good night to everyone else.
My pleasure. Thank you
All right.
all.
You bet.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.